shall we begin? I want to thank Mrs. James H. Dooley.
Oh, you may refer to me as Mrs. Sally Mae Dooley.
Thank you and pardon Mrs. Sally Mae Dooley and Miss Nora Houston for joining us today and agreeing to give us your perspective on quite a contentious issue for you, women's suffrage in the U.S.
My pleasure, and thank you. This, in my opinion, is one of the greatest issues of my time. Of course, along with the continued movement toward equal rights for all of humanity, including our Negro sisters and brothers.
If either of you wouldn't mind giving a brief introduction of yourselves, I would greatly appreciate it.
Aunt Sally, would you like to start?
Well, of course. Thank you. My name is Mrs. Sally Mae Dooley. I am no great orator, nor do I give over to bombast, so while I am flattered, I find myself a bit uncomfortable here today. But as Nora insisted that my point of view on the subject was of importance, here I sit. I am the wife of businessman, philanthropist, and former legislator James Henry Dooley. Maymont is our home.
The estate is lovely and welcoming to all who have a chance to visit.
Thank you.
And would you tell us a little bit about the women's organizations you belong to and your roles there?
Oh, certainly. I have a lineage that I can trace all the way back to one of the first royal governors here in our beautiful state of Virginia. And so I offered my time on the committees of several organizations to continue to uphold the traditions and histories of the Commonwealth and to be with other ladies who understand what it means to do so. I was founding president of the Daughters of the American Revolution's Richmond chapter and sat on the executive committee of the Society of Colonial Dames and the like. So you see, it's important, very important, that we remember and hold up our traditions. That is what it means to be a lady. Something I fear the young women today forget. Not altogether their fault, though, given all of the topsy-turviness of the world these days. It is hard for a lady to remember to be a lady when there are forces about demanding her attention to be held on men's concerns and whatnot.
Miss Houston, would you mind telling us about yourself and involvement in the suffrage movement?
I'm Eleanora Claire Houston, better known as Nora. My mother, Josephine, is Uncle James' sister. I suppose as far as my background is concerned, well, I have been called a deeply spiritual and socially conscious artist. I joined the Art Club of Richmond, where Uncle James was an avid supporter and lecturer when I was in my adolescent years. I suppose I'm most well known for starting the Atelier studio here in Richmond with Adele Clark, my lifelong partner, and maybe somewhat lesser known for my work with the Equal Suffrage League with my mother and Aunt Alice, that league would later become the Virginia League of Women Voters. After the 19th Amendment was passed, and the vote secured for us. I also worked hard to collaborate with the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs to form the Richmond Commission on Interracial Cooperation. We wanted to see Negro women have their opportunities to vote as well and try to disperse with some of the blockades preventing them from doing so.
Mrs. Dooley, would you mind telling us more about the Virginia Association opposed to women's suffrage? You were a member of this organization, is that correct?
Oh, certainly. I was on the executive committee of the association. And of course, I don't mind. That is the essence of why we are all here, I gather. I am certain that my niece has already told you a great deal. The association was of the utmost importance to me. It was our mission to uphold the traditional role of women in the home. Women are to run their households, take care of the families, and be treated with delicacy and care. All concepts that, once again, seem to have fallen by the wayside. I can't begin to imagine why these suffragettes wanted to disrupt their own ways of living by marching to the ballot.
We've had this discussion many times before, Aunt Sally. You know this was an important step for women to take in securing a future for ourselves in the governance of this country.
Our controlling influence as women is purity of thought and action. Men look up to us in this way as the embodiment of all that is good. When woman has lost this influence, she has lost her best protection. As far as I'm concerned, we are now perilously close to losing our rights as women. Soon, women will be expected to come out of the homes and into political office and into the workforce.
Aunt Sally, women have been in the workforce and out of the home already. And as for homemakers not having the vote, I would stand to argue, who better? Now, those women who have the fortune to stay home have far more time to devote to civic duties than those gentlemen who are devoted to business or other such endeavors. And besides, Negro women, particularly in the South, have been in the workforce for centuries. Part of what we all understood also is that should women win the vote, Black women would have the vote as well. And this was a hard pill to swallow and a well-documented driving force for the women opposed to suffrage.
Well, it's just not something that a woman like me may ever get used to. We believed firmly that should women secure the vote, our entire way of life would change. Just the idea. We just weren't willing to see the ways that we conduct our social lives here in Virginia uprooted by the potential to be outnumbered by Negro women at the polls. I have never lived in a society where that was even a possibility. I won't be judged for my point of view. It was and always has been the way of things. Now, if you'll excuse me, Nora, thank you for the invitation. I'll take my leave.
Aunt Sally.
Miss Houston, thank you for sharing your background. Would you mind sharing your point of view on why securing suffrage for women was so important to you and your organization?
It was simply time for women to be enfranchised with the same rights to represent ourselves and our interests in the same way that men have. I stood on street corners to declare this fact. I remember one incident in particular where stones were hurled my way as I made a speech simply to declare that to be a woman was to be part of the human race. And if we are all to be part of the human race, we must be represented equally in our courts and in our government. I keep one of those stones with me to this day. It reminds me of the sacrifice and victory that we can now declare.
The Equal Suffrage League circulated hundreds of pamphlets hoping to compel women to advocate for their right to vote. One of them is entitled, "Who Represents Her?" Do you remember what arguments were laid out there?
Of course I do. Essentially, it pointed out that if a woman is to answer for any of her debts to society, say a widow fails to pay her taxes, or an impoverished sister feels compelled to steal to make ends meet, or forges a signature when she has no support from her husband. Now, in these cases, men are not inclined to take her place, to represent her in her penalties, so then, why should men be allowed to represent all women at the ballot box? If men will not take a woman's place in prison, why should he supplant her knowledge and wisdom in making decisions for our government?
Will you tell us more about the Interracial Cooperation Commission?
Well, I would be happy to, but I have invited two women who I think may be more an authority on our work there together. They've arrived just now. Or, Mrs. Walker, such a pleasure. Please, come sit. I must ask after Aunt Sally, I'm afraid. No, please, continue.
Oh, we appreciate you coming to speak with us, Mrs. Walker and Mrs. Stokes. Would you please introduce yourselves?
Mrs. Maggie Lena Walker. Mrs. Aura Brown Stokes.
Thank you so much. Uh, Mrs. Walker, would you mind telling us just a little about yourself and your civic and advocacy work here in Richmond?
Well, where to begin? I suppose I'll start with St. Luke's. That's where it all began in my youth. Working with the benevolence organization there when I was 14 and helping to care for the infirm. Eventually, I began teaching, but when I married Armistead, of course, all that stopped. Women weren't allowed to teach once we became wives. Nevertheless, I found myself continuing to work with St. Luke's, worked my way up through the ranks there, founding and editing the newspaper, and securing jobs and training for women. And then, of course, we created the Penny Savings Bank, where I was the bank president. We were looking to empower ourselves economically, invest in black businesses in Jackson Ward, secure our own welfare, all of that. It was difficult, but necessary work.
Thank you. And Mrs. Stokes?
Yes, it is interesting to give biographical information about oneself in this way, but I have an extensive background in sociological work and education, and have trained as a teacher as well. I'm now working as a probationary officer for women and girls in the juvenile courts of Richmond, for which I take no salary. I've headed up numerous committees and organizations here in Richmond and regionally over the years, focused on justice and well-being for Black women.
Thank you. Now, I believe Ms. Houston invited you here to speak briefly about your work with the Commission on Interracial Cooperation and with getting Black women to the polls.
Yes. Before, we were largely left out of the women's suffrage movement here in Richmond. And then, because of our own segregation laws here, we weren't allowed to join the League of Women Voters. That didn't mean we didn't keep fighting and educating in our own communities.
That's right. We formed our own Negro League of Women Voters, where I was the president. It wasn't until after the amendment finally passed that we started to gain some traction and build coalitions with white women, such as Nora, and the Commission on Interracial Cooperation, to get Black women to the polls to exercise our rights. They helped us with some of our fundraising efforts as well.
What did you find to be the biggest challenges for Black women in voting?
Well, there were just so many. From the literacy tests that were required in order to establish eligibility to cast our ballots, to the polling tax that folks had difficulty paying. Black women in particular are often the lowest paid on the wage system, so paying a tax to exercise our right to vote was a big sacrifice.
Just getting Negro women to the polls in the first place was daunting. And I don't just mean physically transporting. I'll talk about that in a minute. But convincing women who are too tired to even care for their families at the end of a long workday, let alone make the effort to put up with the opposition to our voting once they made the effort to get there. We had to educate on the importance of us showing up. We needed our folks to understand that despite the setbacks, their votes mattered.
Yes.
Despite being workers, homemakers, mothers, in fact, because of those conditions, it was of the utmost importance to exercise our civic duty, especially after all the fighting to win the vote.
We created Richmond's first voter registration drive. Maggie and I made speeches all over the city. At the end of the day, 80% of Black voters in this city were women. 80%. When the registration days came in 1920, the first time we were allowed as Black women to do so, we worked with Nora and Adele to organize transportation for those in need. Oh, we were both very familiar with organizing. You know, Maggie headed up the trolley boycott in 1904 to oppose the Jim Crow laws and lynching and unequal education for Black children. Folks were tired of being forced to sit in the back of those trolleys after a day's work, heading back and forth to white folks' homes and the factories and such.
Yes. And I wasn't going to let the lack of registrars at City Hall force us back either. You see, they had only assigned us one registrar for the Negro women in the basement, as opposed to 3 upstairs for the white women. Aura and I set up a phone tree network to make sure that our women would spend as little time as possible waiting in the lines. We couldn't have them sacrificing their jobs, but because of our phone tree, we had so many women showing up that that man, what was his name, Aura?
Yes, Registrar Woodson.
Yes, Woodson. He was trying to close up early with 100 more women down in that basement. Now, I insisted we needed Negro registrars, myself included, to circumvent the obvious discrimination. Unfortunately, we still had some turned away in September, but no matter. In October, we were back.
Oh, yes. And well, even then, it took Nora and Adele appealing to the city electoral board to keep the offices open because we had so many wanting to register. Remember? When that Officer Ingram, thought we were through and said, I guess there will not be many to turn away this time when closing time comes. I looked right at him and said, there is more to come. Mm-hmm. I've got them lined up in Jackson Ward waiting for the word. They are ready to come when I call them.
Sounds like it was a triumph.
Well, it was important to start to take advantage of our recent enfranchisement. Yes. It was a day I'm sure my mother and her enslavement never imagined we would see. Mm. We had earned the right to be involved in our local government, and it had to be done. Listen, women are the guardians of our city's youth, and in my opinion, it would have been irresponsible to leave the task of selecting our councilmen to just the men.
Yes.
Because the children of Richmond's future may have depended on that election.
Well, thank you both so much for your time and insight.
Well done.
My pleasure.